We're reviewing episode 18 called City of Steel of Generation 1 of the Transformers. So let's get into it. This is Energon Entries. Welcome back to Energon Entries, everybody. As always, this is your host, Matt Freites. I hope that this finds you well. I want to thank everybody for tuning in, as I always do. It's amazing to see this show grow, and I just am really appreciative of everybody's time. Before we get into the episode recap, I want to make two announcements. First things first, I did a YouTube-only review of Transformers 1, the latest movie that came out. I have a YouTube channel, Energon Entries. Right now, it's only audio episodes. However, if you want to go there a little bit later this week, you can find the video review that I did of Transformers 1. I very much enjoyed it, but I gave some detailed thoughts in that video, and I'd love to know if video content is something you want to see going forward. It won't be just retreads of what I talk about here. I want it to be interesting, I want it to be unique, and I want it to be something that is a supplement to what we do here on Energon Entries, so please let me know. Second thing, I'm going to be starting an Instagram account for this podcast. I know that I've said that I don't have social media for this. I think that Instagram works well for me. I'm not somebody who's really good at making posts on Twitter, Facebook, things like that. But I think that here and there, showing a picture, I have some of the toys here, obviously showing pictures of when new content comes out. I think it's a better way to engage. I certainly would love to have an Instagram group that people can DM me on and that we can kind of talk about these things together. Right now, it's just the only way that I think I want to do social media, but I want to be at least accessible to people because I've had some people reach out asking why I don't have it. So those are two announcements coming in hot from this week. Hope you enjoyed last week's episode. And with that, let's get to the episode recap. The episode begins with Laserbeak flying into the Decepticons' underground base where the Constructicons are secretly digging beneath New York City. After hours of work, they sink the Empire State Building underground. The Autobots finally get wind of this and head to the city, only to be ambushed by Soundwave and his crew in Central Park. While battling, Optimus Prime falls into the Decepticons' base and is rendered powerless by Megatron, who reveals his plan to turn New York City into new Cybertron. Seemingly victorious, Megatron orders the disassembly of Prime, but Optimus fights back, even as a pile of parts. Meanwhile, Spike, Bumblebee, Ratchet, Hound, and Mirage sneak into the city to rescue Prime. After discovering that the Decepticons have turned Prime's body parts into a robotic alligator, they manage to reassemble Optimus minus his right arm. The Autobots then attack the Decepticons, reclaim Prime's arm, and fend off Devastator in a battle atop a Cybertronian-styled Empire State Building. The episode ends with the Autobots saving the city, Optimus back together, and Bumblebee keeping an I Heart New York bumper sticker as a souvenir before they roll out and return home. So as is important to me with content, I always want to evolve. I always want to get better as we go along. And while I know a lot of you have been enjoying the way that I have done this, when I listen back myself, I feel like the episodes have been a little bit haphazard. I've been giving you my thoughts in chronological order as I watch them at home. And when I listen back to them, I find it boring. And so I want to do something a little bit different. I want to kind of organize my thoughts a little bit better than I have. So what we're going to do for this episode anyway is talk about first my non-robot thoughts. Now, seeing the Twin Towers at the beginning of the episode, in my opinion, was weird because if you're alive now and you were alive on September 11th, 2001, I think that was a worldwide phenomenon. Obviously, it affected the United States more than anybody else, but the Twin Towers are no longer there. There is a singular tower there, but when you see the Twin Towers, it kind of evokes emotion of that day. And I thought it was an evocative visual. And I always feel that way whenever I see it in movies or TV shows. And it's something that really dates the material. Also, later on in the episode, when the Empire State Building is demolished, or at least stolen, and they put up a new building, a new Cybertronian building, which is supposed to kind of mimic the Empire State Building, seeing the Seekers fly through that building again, it made me think of the Twin Towers and it made me think of September 11th. And again, this is not to be emotional about it. It's just, this is updated times. September 11th, 2001 is something that has happened in history by the time I'm watching these. It had not occurred yet when this episode came out. So I'm trying to give you perspective of today's mind, today's Matt, and that's something that I thought about. This episode was full of puns, and the writers really had the Autobots laying it on super thick throughout. But I think really many of the puns took place and revolved around Optimus Prime's arm being retrieved. That whole scene where it's shooting down with his cannon, that's where you heard a lot of the puns from the Autobots. But Megatron himself made somewhat of a joke, I would say, when he said to Optimus Prime something about suspended animation when speaking about Optimus Prime being unable to move. And I thought that has to be something that's sort of an inside joke with writers and animators and so forth, because Optimus Prime is a cartoon. He's been rendered motionless, suspended animation. You get it, dad joke of the year. But honestly, it's not a complaint about the puns. It's really what's at the core of cartoons of this time period. It's what they were all about. And if you go back and watch Ninja Turtles, you go back and watch He-Man, you go back and watch anything from this time period, this general period, you're going to find a lot of puns. That's what the 80s was all about. Now, as it came to the overall plan on the part of the Decepticons, I think the overall plan to invade and take over New York City is a smart plan. The only better plan that they had, and you could argue as to whether it's better or not, but when they worked with the people from Atlantis way early on in Season 2 to take over Washington, D.C., I would say that that was a pretty smart plan, because if you're going to take over the United States, taking over the government is a great way to do that. But of course, one of the things that's cliche in the show all the time is that the Decepticons do things that seem like they're on a really large scale, and neither the Autobots nor the humans know what's happening. And I wonder, how did no one know that the Decepticons were building this massive layer underneath New York City, one of the largest cities in the entire world? But it's okay, because it's something that's consistent, at least throughout this show. This plan by the Decepticons and Megatron, it caused a lot of chaos because there were a lot of lost buildings, and I have to assume people within these buildings. The Empire State Building is not empty every single day. So when the Empire State Building comes down in the middle of the day, what happened to those people? We never hear about that. It's replaced by a Cybertronian building. By the time we get to the third act of this episode, there are a ton of these buildings. What happened to the people? And this is going to be a major cleanup effort. The damage, though, was cleaned up in an instant at the end of the episode. And the Autobots did so, it seemed, rapidly. And it made me wonder how an iconic building like the Empire State Building, was it replaced? Was it recovered? What did they do with it? They never really said that. That's a huge piece, and I feel like a huge plot hole here that wasn't ever talked about, but by the end of the episode, the city was fine. Overall, though, I have to ask, if this is considered one of the best plans for Megatron, which I do think that it is, if you're going to take over New York City, you're going to have a huge foothold in taking over this country. If this plan doesn't work, I have to ask, will any of his plans work? Switching from the overall narrative and overall plan of this episode, let's talk about some of the things that the humans contributed in this. But not much interaction from the humans in this episode, if I'm being honest, outside of what I talked about earlier with New York City being destroyed, what happened to those people. But I think that it's hilarious that at one point, Spike obviously is in this episode. He's the only human that I remember in this episode. They're coming up to stop traffic on what I have to assume is the Brooklyn Bridge. And they notice that, well, there's traffic. They can't get out. I think they said Autobots and humans are trying to evacuate the city. And Spike has this epiphany that he knows how they can defeat the Decepticons. And he says, Bumblebee, take a left. And the next scene that you see is not the Autobots taking a left, but it's the Autobots coming down an off-ramp right next to the bridge on the right side of the bridge. I don't know whether they turned around. Somebody can claim that they turned around and ended up taking a left, but he said directly as they were stopped in traffic to take a left, and they didn't. One of those weird 80s continuity things that doesn't matter to the kids that are going to buy these toys, but it matters to me in the terms of this episode. So when you talk about the Autobots here, the episode to me centers around the kidnapping of Optimus Prime by Megatron, obviously the creation of new Cybertron, but the secondary plot that involved the Autobots had to do with Optimus Prime being captured. And once they captured him, Megatron decided to disassemble him. He asked Hook of the Constructicons to do so. Somehow that didn't kill him, though. I'm not really sure how all of that works. All of his body parts are apart, but all you have to do is fuse two wires together, and his life force seems like it was still there. He's able to talk through his head. Not sure how that works. And later it's stated that Hook wasn't careful enough, and that's why Optimus Prime was able to live, I guess. I don't really know, they don't really explain. But his life force remained within his brain, and all of his wiring was not together, but somehow his life force was there. And there have been lots of instances in this show where Optimus Prime seems to be mortally wounded, comes out better on the other side, and he's still kicking. That's what kind of a leader he is. Again, not much of an explanation, but it seems as if partially the will to defeat Megatron, the will to make sure that freedom is the right of all sentient beings, it's a large factor in his life force staying alive even after he was disassembled. The only explanation we get is that Hook was not careful, which is ironic because Hook said he was going to use finesse. He was going to be precise. But Prime's life force not only exists within his head, but it's able to control the rest of his body through telekinesis. At least it appears that way. It's a really neat thing to have if you think about it. If your head gets chopped off, you can then tell your body what to do. His body was put to evil use by Megatron, and it was put to evil use against him and his fellow Autobots. And obviously Optimus Prime being sort of an Abe Lincoln type, that had to hurt his soul, knowing that he was potentially responsible for hurting one of his fellow Autobots, which is why I think it was actually a pretty neat thing by Megatron to do. I think the worst of the offenses was his arm and cannon being used the way that it was to essentially be a barrier between the Autobots getting into this new Empire State Building built within New Cybertron. Outside of Optimus Prime, if you talk about some of these other Autobots, two really come to mind. The first thing that came to mind was Hound to me in this episode, and has shown throughout most of Season 2 that he's one of the most useful Autobots. If you recall in Season 1, he was featured quite a bit, and then he kind of took a back seat because Spike initially had what seemed like a budding friendship with him, and then switched over to Bumblebee. Now we see Hound in a Spike-less role, but I think his plans this season in particular have really helped the Autobots out. And obviously, no soldier is perfect. In Season 1, he lost the key or dropped the key to Ravage's cage, which caused some chaos. But look, nobody's perfect. But I think throughout this season, one of the most underrated Autobots in the group. And the other thing that I noticed was Wheeljack making a King Kong reference when Devastator was climbing this huge building. This isn't the first time that Wheeljack has shown a propensity to sort of engage in human pop culture. I think it was in the Autobot Spike episode, which I think was the first episode of Season 2, where they had him watching like soap operas, or they had him watching television, and that's where he encountered Frankenstein. And I believe that was on Wheeljack's design. That was something that Wheeljack suggested that he do. Wheeljack's a smart guy. He seems to want to understand humans, and I think that's a nice little continuity piece. Switching over to the Decepticons, though, a very Constructicon-centric episode. Megatron's plan, at least at the beginning, allowed them all to kind of show off a unique skill that they had. And you see this in the beginning when they're stealing the Empire State Building, Mixmaster causing some acid, Scavenger doing his thing, Hook having his plans. There's just so many things in that one scene that only took a couple of minutes where you saw that individually the Constructicons have a lot of value. They did show in that scene, though, some signs of cracking because they were bickering with each other. This may be their fatal flaw, but I think it's also a way to differentiate them between the Autobots and the Decepticons, is that no team on the Decepticons is a real cohesive team, but the Autobots are a cohesive team. Later on in the episode, Devastator comes about, which he always does, and it dawned on me that Devastator always seems to be a last resort whenever the Constructicons are involved. And you'd think that would be the opposite. You'd think that they would want to harness the power of Devastator early on to try and gain an advantage. But as strong as he is, it seems like he's always defeated pretty easily in the end. They've never really mentioned it, but I do wonder if it's because when they are Devastator and they are their combiner form, they don't have the same brain power as they do as individual robots. Something to think about, but I have noticed that as powerful as Devastator is, he doesn't have the upper hand for long. However, when they were not Devastator, their plan to mobilize iconic New York City cabs, you know the cabs I'm talking about, the yellow cabs, which were iconic until Uber started. Mobilizing those against the Autobots, to me, is kind of a great touch in terms of New York City. It's a great way to be recognizable for New York City and a great way to pay homage to something that is iconic or was iconic within the city. Now, Megatron, another solid plan, another poorly executed plan in my opinion. His idea to capture Prime was a great one, but I have to ask, why didn't he just kill him? He could have still used his body parts as weapons, but he could have eliminated Optimus Prime for good. And this goes back to his similar inability to take out Starscream for one reason or another. For some reason, Megatron can't pull the trigger, for lack of a better term, on his enemies, and that's going to bite him in the butt. You know it is. But you see his insecurity comes out later when Spike, of all people, of all beings, sends him a really cheesy insult, and Megatron actually became insulted, offended. He took the bait. So Megatron, under all of this power seeking, all of this hunger, he's an insecure bot. And I think that it's a fascinating look. We don't see it too often, but Spike apparently can get it out of him. And in the same vein for other Decepticons, in the same vein as Hound, Laserbeak to me is the most useful Decepticon of the bunch. He always accomplishes what he is asked to do. And yes, there was an episode recently where Soundwave and the tapes didn't meet Megatron's standards and he chewed them out. It wasn't Laserbeak's fault. Whenever Laserbeak has to do something individually, he always does it. Animation quirk time. There was one animation quirk that I saw, and it was during a scene where the crown of Optimus Prime's head, part of it was colored gray, when most of the time it is fully colored blue outside of his face, of course. So that was one animation quirk that I saw. Overall, this was a fast-paced episode, and it seemingly had 3 acts in my opinion. The first was to establish new Cybertron and capture Optimus Prime. The second act was for the Autobots to rescue him. And the third act was for the Autobots to defeat the Decepticons in this big battle at the end. In my opinion, way too much happened in this episode, and nothing in the episode was really given time to breathe. There was a lot that they could have worked with, and this kind of plot, this kind of story, would have been better suited as a multi-part episode because they would have been able to build on some of these acts a little bit more. You could have built on the Constructicons' usefulness, on their bickering. You could have built on the Autobots being without their leader for a little bit longer. You could have built on a lot of different things that they just missed an opportunity on, in my opinion. And I believe that they missed an opportunity to make Devastator look more powerful, even in defeat. Devastator so far, powerful for a little bit, weak, and then gets defeated very, very easily. It was a fine episode in terms of entertainment. It wasn't like it was boring. It just a lot happened, and it was a little too busy for my taste. Our next review is going to be the 2-part miniseries called Dissection of the Dinobots. We'll review part 1 and part 2 separately. And again, look out for my initial review on YouTube of Transformers 1. I think it's good, but I'd love to know if you want to have more video content. We're trying to evolve the show. I'm trying to give you a little bit more because I'm seeing people coming to the show. I'm seeing the numbers go up, and I want this content to evolve with what you, the Transformer fan, wants. What did you think of this episode? Have you watched it recently? I'd love to know what you think. Overall, email me. mattyicemedia@gmail.com is the way to do that. A big shout out to the people that have. A reminder again, I'm going to be creating an Instagram page, and you will see that in the show notes whenever it is created. Hope this finds everybody well. I hope this finds everybody safe, and I will talk to you next time. This is Energon Entries. The opinions and viewpoints expressed on Energon Entries are those of Matt Freites and his guests, and not necessarily those of the Matty Ice Media Network. Energon Entries is exclusively owned by Matt Freites and is brought to you by the Matty Ice Media Network.